positive steps. I think it is unnecessary, and for those reasons I will oppose this bill and not commend it to the House.
Call James Shaw, 5 minutes in reply.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it has been fascinating watching a number of members of the National Party speaking against something that the corporate sector has been engaged in for the last 25 years. And in particular, people who have actually had some background in the corporate sector, like Andrew Bailey and Chris Bishop, as David Cunliffe said, contort themselves, pirouette reasons for speaking against the bill, when in fact they're quite well aware that the sector that they purport to represent has been doing this kind of thing forever. I'm just going to rattle through some of the objections. One is that was made is that it is unnecessary because we already measure some of these things. Mr. Speaker, government doesn't act in alignment. So, for example, on the one hand, we sign up to the Paris Agreement and say that we want to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, and on the other, the Minister for Natural Resources opens up an enormous block area for oil and gas exploration, which, if burned, would massively contribute to global warming. So the government says one thing on one hand and then does precisely the opposite on the other. One of the reasons why we want to have integrated reporting at the level of the Minister of Finance in the Public Finance Act is to create single-point accountability that joins up government. The members from the National Party who have spoken against this bill have essentially been arguing against the notion of a balanced scorecard, the notion that you would have a dashboard of indicators. It's sort of like saying, I'm going to go driving, but the only indicator on my dashboard is going to be RPM. Well, RPM is not terribly helpful if you want to determine how fast you're driving or how safely you're driving or where the lights are or anything like that. So they're saying that they only want one measure, and it's essentially what's going on under the hood. Mr. Speaker, one of the other objections was that there are too many indicators, and as I have said, that the reason why you have a select committee process at all is so that you can improve the bill. So I don't think it is terribly valid to say, we think the bill is flawed, therefore it shouldn't go to select committee. That's the whole point of having select committees. Mr. Speaker, I just want to touch on briefly some of the points around gross domestic product, because it does seem that there is actually unanimity across the House on the limitation of gross domestic product. Simon O'Connor did say that it is well understood. It is actually not well understood. When I was doing my master's program, there was a guest speaker, Dr. Bob Ayres from INSEAD, who is both a nuclear physicist and an economist, and has looked at what gross domestic product actually is composed of. And we actually only know about 45% of a GDP number in terms of direct causation, right? The remaining 55% of GDP is largely correlation. There's some stuff happening over here in the economy, and the GDP number is this. And so we think probably there's some form of relationship, but we can't exactly say why. So even GDP itself actually is poorly understood, let alone a very limited measure of anything. Mr. Speaker, all this bill does is improve our understanding of capital. So, as Stuart Nash said, I think he gave a really brilliant point. Our natural capital is our greatest asset. Here in New Zealand, a country with tourism as its primary source of income and its second largest source of income from the primary industries which take place in the environment, our natural capital is our greatest asset. And so for what we're suggesting is that the Minister of Finance simply understands, alongside our appreciation of financial capital, an appreciation of our natural capital, and that some kind of balance between those sort of sets of indicators makes a lot of sense, especially for a country like New Zealand. So, Mr. Speaker, it is disappointing that despite apparently unanimously across the House agreement about the principles of this bill and the underlying flaws in the way that we currently measure things, that New Zealand First and the National Party are going to vote against this bill despite the fact that they basically completely agree with everything in it. So, Mr. Speaker, it is sad, but this is an idea whose time has come. The private sector has been doing this for decades, and we will get there. Parliament can be a place that considers good ideas.
Members, this debate has concluded. The question is that the motion be agreed to. Those of that opinion will say aye.
Aye.
To the contrary, no. The noes have it.
Party vote.
A party vote's been called for.